Welcome back to Today in History, the channel where the past comes alive one incredible day at a time. If you live stories of courage, sacrifice, and the moments that quietly shaped the world we live in, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Because today's story is one of the most emotional farewells in American history. It's a story about an army that won a war and then simply walked away. No parade, no fireworks. Just a tired, unpaid, half-starved group of men going home, led by a general who could have been a king but chose instead to become a farmer. This is the story of November the 2nd, 1783, the day George Washington said goodbye to his army. Picture a small farmhouse called Rockingham, near Rocky Hill in New Jersey. It's early November. The trees are bare, the air is sharp and cold, and inside this modest home, a tall, weary man sits at a writing desk. He is 51 years old. His hands, once steady enough to lead cavalry charges, now tremble slightly as he writes. This is George Washington, Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, and he is composing what he believes will be the final message he will ever give to the soldiers, who followed him through 8 brutal years of war. He calls it his farewell orders. But to understand why this letter matters so much, we have to go back. Back to where this army came from, and everything it survived to get to this quiet farmhouse in New Jersey. Let's rewind to the spring of 1775. Shots have just been fired at Lexington and Concord. Colonial militias, farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, ordinary men with muskets have surrounded the British Army in Boston. The Continental Congress, meeting in Philadelphia, needs someone to take command of this chaotic, undisciplined mass of volunteers and turn it into something resembling an army. They choose a Virginia planter, a former surveyor and militia officer, a man who has seen combat in the French and Indian War but has never commanded anything on this scale. His name is George Washington. He accepts the commission and reportedly refuses any salary, asking only that Congress cover his expenses. On July 3, 1775, he rides out to take command of the troops surrounding Boston under an elm tree in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He looks at the men before him, and by most accounts, he is not impressed. They are brave, yes, but they are farmers with pitchforks and hunting rifles, not soldiers. There is no uniform, no discipline, barely any gunpowder. Washington's first job isn't fighting the British. It's building an army out of nothing. And for the next 8 years, that army will be tested in ways that almost defy belief. Think about Valley Forge, the winter of 1777 into 1778. No dramatic battle happens there. It's worse than a battle. It's a slow, grinding test of endurance. Nearly 12,000 soldiers camp in the frozen Pennsylvania countryside with almost no food. No shoes and thin, rotting blankets. Men wrap rags around their bare feet, leaving bloody footprints in the snow. Disease sweeps through the camp, killing more soldiers that winter than enemy bullets ever could. Historians estimate that as many as 2,000 men die from starvation, exposure, and sickness during those brutal months. And through it all, Washington stays. He doesn't retreat to a warm house in Philadelphia. He shares the same freezing conditions, writes desperate letters to Congress begging for supplies that rarely come, and somehow, through sheer stubborn will, keeps the army from completely dissolving. It's at Valley Forge more than any battlefield, where the Continental Army is truly forged, hardened into a fighting force that can stand toe-to-toe with the most powerful military in the world. But the suffering doesn't end with Valley Forge. Throughout the war, Congress is broke. The soldiers are paid in continental currency that becomes almost worthless, a paper money so devalued that the phrase "not worth a continental" enters the American vocabulary. Soldiers go months, sometimes years, without seeing a single coin. Many have left farms and families behind, and now their wives and children are struggling without them, while these men freeze and starve in defense of a country that isn't even fully paying them. It's a wonder the army doesn't mutiny outright. And, in truth, it almost does more than once. By the spring of 1783, the war is essentially over. British and American negotiators have signed preliminary peace terms, and everyone knows independence has been won. But here's the cruel irony. Now that the fighting has stopped, the soldiers' patience runs out. They've endured hunger, cold, and years without pay while risking their lives, and now, with peace at hand, Many officers fear Congress will simply disband the army and send everyone home without ever settling what they're owed. Anonymous letters begin circulating among the officers encamped at Newburgh, New York. These letters suggest that if Congress won't pay what it owes, perhaps the army should refuse to disband or worse, march on the government itself. This moment, remembered today as the Newburgh Conspiracy, is one of the most dangerous in the entire history of the young United States. An armed, battle-hardened, unpaid army, angry at its own government, is a recipe for a coup. On March 15, 1783, Washington calls a meeting of his officers to address the growing unrest. He wasn't originally going to attend, but he shows up unannounced, understanding the gravity of the moment. He steps up to speak and pulls out a written speech. As he begins to read, he pauses, reaches into his coat, and pulls out a pair of eyeglasses that almost none of his men have ever seen him wear in public. He says, quietly, something to the effect that he has grown gray in the service of his country, and now finds himself growing blind. It's a small, humanizing, almost vulnerable moment, and it works. Many of the hardened officers in that room, men who had survived years of brutal combat, are said to have been moved to tears. The tension breaks. The talk of rebellion fades. Washington, through nothing more than a quiet, personal gesture, has single-handedly prevented what could have become a military coup against the very government the army had just fought to establish. It's one of the most underrated moments in American history. A war nearly ending not in victory, but in the army turning on its own country, stopped only by one man's restraint and character. By September of 1783, the Treaty of Paris is formally signed, officially ending the Revolutionary War and recognizing the United States as an independent nation. The dream that began with a ragtag militia under an elm tree in Cambridge has become reality. But now comes a strange, almost anticlimactic problem. What do you do with an army once the war it was built to fight is over? On October 18, 1783, the Continental Congress issues a proclamation thanking the army for its long and faithful service, and ordering that soldiers who enlisted for the duration of the war be discharged, with officers allowed to go home on furlough starting the next day. 11 days later, a supplemental order extends this, calling for the disbanding of the remaining army by November 4th. The Great Continental Army, the force that had stared down the most powerful empire on Earth and won, is simply being told, "You're free to go home." And this is where our story arrives at that quiet farmhouse in Rocky Hill, New Jersey, where Washington sits down to write his final message to the men who had given him and their country everything. He calls it his farewell orders to the armies of the United States. Dated November 2nd, 1783. Unlike a battlefield speech shouted over cannon fire, this is a written address, meant to be read aloud to the scattered remnants of the army and printed in newspapers so that every soldier, no matter how far away they had already traveled, could hear his final words to them. He begins by acknowledging that Congress has ordered the discharge of the troops, and that it now falls to him as Commander-in-Chief to address the army one final time. In his own words, preserved for us across 2.5 centuries, he writes, "It only remains for the Commander-in-Chief to address himself once more, and that for the last time, to the armies of the United States, however widely dispersed the individuals who compose them may be, and to bid them an affectionate, a long farewell." Read those words again. An affectionate, a long farewell. Not a formal military dismissal. Not a cold bureaucratic notice. An affectionate farewell from a general who had shared the mud, the hunger, and the fear of death with these men for the better part of a decade. He goes on to reflect on everything the army had accomplished, calling it almost providential, a small, poorly equipped, poorly paid force somehow defeating the greatest military power in the world. He reminds them that history will remember this as one of the most remarkable achievements ever recorded. Ordinary citizen soldiers, farmers, and tradesmen, standing against professional armies and winning not just battles, but an entire nation's independence. Then Washington does something remarkably personal for a military order. He thanks each part of the army individually. He thanks his general officers for their counsel through so many difficult moments. He thanks the commanders of regiments for carrying out his orders with zeal and precision. He thanks his staff officers for their tireless work behind the scenes. And then, in words that would have meant the world to the exhausted, unpaid soldiers reading or hearing them, he thanks the non-commissioned officers and the ordinary privates for what he calls their extraordinary patience in suffering and their invincible fortitude in action. Think about that phrasing. He isn't just praising their bravery in battle. He is specifically honoring their patience in suffering, acknowledging directly the hunger, the cold, the unpaid months, the sheer misery these men endured. He saw it, he remembered it, and in his final message to them, he made sure they knew it mattered to him. He closes this section of the letter by expressing what he calls his inviolable attachment and friendship to the men of the various branches of the army, wishing that it were within his power to be more useful to them in their future civilian lives, and expressing hope that they would believe he had done everything within propriety to help secure what was due to them. Then, in the sections that follow, he offers something almost like a piece of fatherly advice to men about to re-enter civilian society after years of war. He encouraged them to carry the same discipline, economy, and industriousness into their private lives that had made them such an effective fighting force, suggesting that the same virtues which had won them a war could also secure them a peaceful and prosperous future as citizens. And then quietly the order ends. No trumpets. No grand ceremony described within its lines. Just a written farewell, meant to travel by paper and printing press to soldiers who had already scattered across a young, exhausted nation, walking home to farms and towns they hadn't seen in years, and that's part of what makes this moment in history so uniquely powerful and, frankly, so different from how we imagine these things today. There was no single dramatic scene of an entire army standing at attention as Washington rode past on his horse for the last time. Tears in every eye, the way it might play out in a movie. By November of 1783, much of the army had already been sent home on furlough back in June months earlier, quietly dispersing in smaller groups as the peace negotiations dragged on. Many of these soldiers walked hundreds of miles back to their homes, often with little or no pay in their pockets, wearing threadbare uniforms, some without shoes, carrying only their muskets and whatever meager belongings they had left. Historians describe scenes of soldiers begging for food along the roads home, farmers turning away hungry veterans because they had nothing to spare either. This was the true, unglamorous cost of the American Revolution. Independence had been won, but it had been paid for by ordinary men who often received little more than a folded piece of paper, thanking them for their sacrifice. And no immediate compensation for years of service. So when Washington's farewell orders reached these men, wherever they happened to be by that point, it wasn't a grand parade. It was often read aloud in scattered camps or printed in local newspapers, reaching men in fields and taverns and farmhouses far from where the war had actually been fought. And for many of these soldiers, this letter was the last direct word they would ever receive from the general who had led them through the entire war. Imagine being a young private, maybe 17 or 18 years old when you enlisted, now in your 20s having survived musket fire, disease, and years away from home. Reading these words from the only military commander you had ever known, an affectionate, a long farewell. For many, it must have felt like the closing of the most intense and defining chapter of their lives. But Washington's own personal farewell to his army wasn't quite finished. Not entirely. While the farewell orders of November 2nd were addressed to the army broadly, in writing there was one more deeply emotional, deeply human moment still to come, one that has become legendary in American memory. On December 4th, 1783, at Fraunces Tavern in New York City, Washington gathered with his most senior officers, the men who had been by his side through the entire war, for one final in-person goodbye. By this point, the British had evacuated New York City just days earlier, ending 8 years of occupation, and Washington was preparing to travel south to formally resign his commission to Congress. Before he left, he wanted to say goodbye to the officers who had become something, like a family to him over the long years of conflict. The scene inside the long room at Fraunces Tavern that day has been described by multiple eyewitnesses and preserved in numerous historical accounts. Washington enters the room, and according to accounts from officers present, his emotion is visible immediately. He fills a glass of wine, turns to the assembled group of generals and officers and raises it, saying something to the effect of, "With a heart full of love and gratitude, I now take leave of you. I most devoutly wish that your latter days may be as prosperous and happy as your former ones have been glorious and honorable." He asks each officer to come forward and take his hand. What happens next is, by every account, one of the most emotionally raw moments in American military history. One by one, these hardened veterans of years of brutal war step forward. And instead of a formal handshake, Washington embraces each man, and by several accounts, both Washington and his officers are in tears, unable to speak, communicating their farewell through embraces alone because words simply aren't enough. Henry Knox, one of Washington's most trusted generals, is said to have been the first to step forward, and the two men embrace for a long moment in complete silence. One after another, the officers come forward. Grown men, men who had commanded troops through cannon fire and freezing winters without flinching, are reduced to silent tears in that small tavern room. When the last officer has embraced him, Washington, unable to bear the silence any longer, simply raises his hand in a final gesture of farewell and walks out of the room without another word. He proceeds down to the Hudson River, where a barge is waiting to carry him across. And as he departs, the assembled officers, still gathered at the tavern, walk out onto the wharf in complete silence, watching their commander disappear across the water. No one speaks. There are simply men standing at the edge of a river, watching the person who had led them through the impossible sail quietly away from their lives. If the farewell orders of November 2nd were Washington's formal, written goodbye to the army as a whole, the scene at Fraunce's Tavern was its deeply personal, human counterpart, the raw, unscripted emotion beneath the official words. And what happens next takes the story from remarkable to genuinely historic on a global scale. Washington travels south to Annapolis, Maryland, where the Continental Congress is currently in session. And on December 23, 1783, he appears before Congress to do something that, at the time, was almost unthinkable for a victorious military commander to do voluntarily. He resigns his commission. He gives up all military power. Consider the context here. Washington has just led a successful revolution against the most powerful empire on earth. He commands the loyalty of a battle-hardened army. There is no meaningful force in the country capable of stopping him if he wanted to seize power for himself. Throughout history, again and again, we see military leaders who win a revolution turn around and crown themselves as new rulers. From Julius Caesar to Napoleon Bonaparte just a few decades later. The temptation to hold on to power, especially when you're the most popular and trusted man in the entire country, is one that has proven irresistible to nearly every successful military leader in human history. Washington does the opposite. Standing before Congress in Annapolis, he delivers a short, formal address thanking Congress for the opportunity to serve, expressing gratitude to his fellow officers for their support throughout the war. And then, in one of the most consequential sentences ever spoken by an American, he says that he is now taking his leave of all the employments of public life, and physically hands over his military commission, the document that gave him command of the entire army, back to Congress. He then leaves immediately to ride home to his estate at Mount Vernon in time, according to popular accounts, to celebrate Christmas with his family for the first time in years. The reaction to this act, both in America and across the Atlantic Ocean, was nothing short of stunned admiration. There's a famous story repeated by multiple historians, though its exact wording varies across sources, that when King George III of Britain, the very monarch Washington had just defeated, was told that Washington intended to resign his military power and return to his farm rather than make himself king. The king reportedly said that if Washington truly does that, he will be the greatest man in the world. Whether or not that exact quote is perfectly verified, the sentiment behind it captures something historically true. Washington's voluntary resignation of power stunned the world because it was almost without precedent. Ancient Rome had its own legend of this kind of selfless leadership, the story of Cincinnatus, a Roman farmer who was given absolute power as dictator during a military crisis, won the war, and then, rather than clinging to power, simply resigned and returned to his plow. For centuries, Cincinnatus had been held up as an almost mythical ideal, a hypothetical standard of virtue that no real leader ever seemed to actually live up to. And here was George Washington in real time in the modern world actually doing it. This single act, arguably even more than any battlefield victory, is why Washington is remembered not just as a successful general, but as one of the most important figures in the history of self-government. Because a revolution is not truly proven successful the moment independence is declared, or even the moment a peace treaty is signed. It is proven successful in the years that follow, when the people who fought for that freedom decide what kind of nation to build with it. If Washington had seized power in 1783, the United States might have simply traded one king for another, an American monarch instead of a British one. Instead, by voluntarily stepping down and returning to civilian life as a private citizen, Washington set a precedent that would shape the entire structure of American government for the next 2.5 centuries. It established from the very beginning the principle that military power must always answer to civilian government, and that no single individual, no matter how popular, how heroic, or how beloved, should be above the systems of government the country had just fought to establish. This precedent echoes forward through American history in ways that are easy to overlook today. When Washington later became the first president of the United States in 1789, he served 2 terms and then voluntarily stepped down again, refusing to seek a 3rd term, a tradition that would be followed informally by nearly every American president for the next century and a half, until it was eventually written into law through the 22nd Amendment. Historians widely agree that this pattern of voluntary relinquishment of power, established first at Annapolis in December of 1783 and repeated again when he left the presidency, is one of Washington's most significant and lasting contributions to the American system of government, arguably more important than any individual military victory during the war itself. So let's bring this all back together. On November 2nd, 1783, in a quiet farmhouse in Rocky Hill, New Jersey, George Washington sat down and wrote a farewell letter to an army that had already largely scattered across the countryside, walking home in tattered uniforms after 8 brutal years of war. He thanked them individually by rank and role for enduring suffering that most of us today can barely imagine: freezing winters, empty stomachs, months and years without pay, all in service of an idea. The idea that ordinary people could govern themselves without a king. A month later, in the long room of France's Tavern in New York City, he said goodbye in person to the officers who had become like family to him, in a scene so emotionally raw that grown men wept without shame, communicating through embraces what words could not express. And 3 weeks after that, in Annapolis, Maryland, he did something that shocked the entire world, voluntarily surrendering all of his military power back to the civilian government he had just fought to establish, choosing to become a private citizen again rather than seize the crown that was, quite literally, his for the taking. There is something profoundly moving about a man who could have been king. There's for the taking. There is something profoundly moving about a man who could have been king. About a man who could have been king. Choosing instead to go home and be a farmer. In an era, and honestly in a world, where power is so often seized and clung to at any cost, Washington's farewell to his army, in all its forms, the written orders, the tearful embraces at the tavern, the formal resignation before Congress, stands as one of history's great demonstrations that true strength isn't found in how much power you can seize, but in how much power you're willing to give back. The soldiers who walked home that winter of 1783, hungry, unpaid, and largely unrecognized in their own lifetimes, had helped build something the world had never quite seen before. A nation that, at least in its founding moment, chose principle over power. And it all came full circle in that quiet farewell. An affectionate, a long farewell. From a general who never forgot what his men had given up to make that moment possible. If this story moved you the way it moved us putting it together, do us a huge favor and hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment telling us what part of this story surprised you the most. And share this video with someone who loves history as much as you do. We've got so many more incredible stories from the past waiting to be told. This has been Today in History. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.